All right. Well, welcome everyone to our summer webinar. My name is Amanda. I'm the Learning Program Manager of the IPAI. Our topic for the next hour is preferential assessments. So, we have a great panel today from across the state here to share their experiences dealing with preferential assessments in their office. So, we will start with a panel discussion with our group, which will take about 20 to 30 minutes. During this time, I will request that all of our attendees to please stay muted, but feel free to ask questions throughout the chat if it's relevant to what we're discussing at that time. I'll bring those in as needed. At the end of our formal panel discussion, that's when we will open it up to Q&A from all of you. We want this to feel like a conversation. So please, you can ask your questions in the chat at that time. At that point, you can unmute and talk directly with our panelists. Um, Again, yeah, we just want to make sure during this hour that we are able to, talk through maybe some of the issues that you guys face in your offices about preferential assessments. Also, our recordings from our past webinars are available on our YouTube channel. You can also find them on the IPAI main website, and this includes the last webinar this past May on big box stores. Okay, so it's time to introduce the panel. Today we have with us Amy Allman from Rock Island County. We have Mark Armstrong from Kane County, Maureen Berkowitz from Jackson County, Jennifer Boyd from Lee County, and Tom Hodges from Winnebago County. So I think we got just about the entire state represented by at least one person, which is awesome. So before we start the formal panel discussion, Mark, can you just walk us through a quick overview of preferential assessments to make sure we're all on the same page here?
Absolutely, Amanda. Thank you. So, in general, for assessments, we spend a lot of time talking about equity and uniformity. And the Illinois Constitution calls for assessments to be done uniformly by valuation. So, within that constitutional framework, most of that means 1/3 of fair cash value. But sometimes they call out a preferential assessment for something different. So when we say preferential assessments, we're talking about anything that is valued by a process set out in Article 10 of the Illinois Property Tax Code and not the general procedure set out in Article 9. So there are some specific property categories that we have for these. Amanda, can we take a look at those? All right. So those specific property types are those identified in the property tax code. Again, you'll want to go to Article 10 if you want to find those. So those can be done in several general categories. And what's the next slide there? Oh, just on application. Some of these do require an application. Give you an example. An application is required for open space or model home. However, an application is not required for a developer's preferential assessment for subdivided land or for farm. So those are use-based exemptions, whereas others you have to actually ask for them. Specifically because in some of the cases, and open space is a good example for this, there is a clawback at the end of the process. If somebody does not use it like they said, the tax savings can actually be billed and it can be sent out immediately. It can be subject to tax sale and loss of property for not paying off those differences. So those are some of the things we have it. So what kind of properties in general get preferential assessments? We have 5 general categories. The first one would be the ones for land. Now, those are going to include things like a preferential assessment for open space or a preferential assessment for subdivided land. And theoretically, at least, it includes farm. Now, farm tends to be its own category. So, for instance, if you take the IPAI's course, Preferential Assessments, it's not going to come up with anything about farmland, mainly because farm is so overarching, it's its own category. Every county is going to have farmland, and farmland requires quite a bit of expertise in and of itself. So that wouldn't count for that. The other thing that's not included is the valuation of coal, which is another preferential assessment, but there's only a few places in Illinois where we're still dealing with coal. So it's kind of falling by the wayside. We then have preferential assessments for residential dwellings. These might include things like model home assessment or the preferential assessment that deals with improvements made for certain handicapping conditions. We have preferential assessments for multifamily dwellings. These are generally assessments for low income properties. We have preferential assessments for energy production. And for instance, this is going to look at something along the lines of wind energy devices, solar energy devices such as solar farms, and rooftop solar, where the primary use of it is to generate electricity for use on the property. That's a separate and specific preferential assessment. And then finally, we have kind of a miscellaneous category, such as airports in certain counties. I think my favorite one is a preferential assessment for interstate bridges. We don't have any privately owned interstate bridges anymore, but it's still out there in the property tax code. So at least know that it exists. So that's just a very high level overview of the types of properties that can run in. There's a number that I didn't mention because just going through the list would take quite a bit of time itself. But some of the more common ones we're going to talk about, I'm sure, a little bit more today.
All right, thank you so much, Mark. So I'm going to dive into, let's just start with one of the land preferential assessments conservation stewardship program. I feel like I hear this one a lot at our state conference. This one seems to be a big one that has a lot of moving pieces to it. Tom, I'm going to start with you. Who administers the conservation stewardship program? Oh, and the forestry management program.
Sure, absolutely, Amanda. So both the forestry management program and the conservation stewardship program are administered through the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. As far as the administration of the plan, the development of the plan, the application process goes through them initially, and at the county level, at the county assessment level, we don't really make any changes to conservation stewardship program property or forestry management land until we have that certification that comes from the Illinois Department of Revenue once they receive it from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So a lot of times we have taxpayers inquiring about these programs. We want to be able to provide them with the information that they need, direct them to the proper website, get them the application, get them the forester that they need to contact in order to develop a plan, and so on and so forth. However, we're really not able to implement or do any affect any changes until we do receive that certification from the Illinois Department of Revenue after they receive the proper certification from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources.
So it sounds like there's a lot of, you've got both IDNR and IDOR involved in this. So it sounds like this one is this one of the preferential assessments that has the most offices involved with it?
If it's not, it's probably up there.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have a lot of these in your county?
So currently we have probably 40-ish conservation stewardship program properties, and probably double that amount currently in the forestry management program.
Okay. All right, thanks. On that same topic, Maureen, how flexible is your county when someone's application is in for the conservation stewardship program, but it hasn't been approved yet?
Well, we've got people a lot that the property turns over and they need to fill out a form for a name change and accept the plan. And if they have not done that, we try and write them a letter saying, look, this property has this preferential assessment, and if you don't transfer it over, then you're going to be, taken out of it. So we suggest you get into it and, try and not take them by surprise and all of a sudden yank it out. We have 569 forestry management plans and 98 conservation stewardship. So we have a lot of woods down here. And so anyway, it's a big part of one of my staff person's job in maintaining these. And I think she files them by year. And we get a lot of them every year. And so the taxpayers are pretty astute in knowing about what to do and what it takes. And they get on board and make sure that they get it if they qualify.
All right.
We are a little bit flexible though, if somebody's got an application in and it hasn't come back yet through DOR is the one that sends us the notice. But if they can show us the application signed by our district forester, we'll go ahead and give it to them, because we don't feel they should be penalized just because of staffing problems at the state level. So we try and be flexible with that.
Maureen, I'm amazed at your the amount. I just checked real fast, and we've got 19 conservation, stewardship, and forestry management combined in the whole.
Combined, oh my.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
apparently we've taken all our forests and made them into subdivisions here.
Yes, exactly.
So thank you for sharing that, Maureen. For the rest of the counties, which it sounds like, some of these counties, Mark's example, do not deal with this one nearly as often. Does anyone else on the panel have any flexibility or anything that they do in their office regarding that application process?
Amanda, we generally don't make exceptions. Obviously, we don't have the volume that Maureen has. However, there have been one-off cases where a taxpayer has contacted a forestry management or a forester. They've developed a plan and they failed to submit it to the Department of Natural Resources. And we've actually had the board of review is the entity or the body that makes that adjustment. But like I said, those are one-off type of situations where they kind of have special circumstances.
Gotcha. Thanks, Tom.
Something we've got and we've slowly kind of moved into these is we have 7 wooded acreage transition properties. And because we didn't have a lot of wooded acreage that was getting farm when we did the Bulletin 810 conversion a couple of decades ago, that we didn't have a need for a lot of this. We've just kind of discovered a few parcels here and there, and we've moved them over into wooded acreage transition. So I don't think we have the base that could give us a lot like Maureen seems to have.
Yeah, we have 29. No, wait a minute. We have 45 0029s. And we're down. Luckily they sell and move, and we're down to 45. So hopefully we can get rid of that category at some point.
So Maureen, outside of farmland, which I'm assuming you have a lot of as well in your county, is this one of the most common preferential assessments you deal with?
Definitely. Yeah. Conservation stewardship.
Gotcha. Amy, how many conservation stewardship preferential assessments do you have in your county? I'm kind of curious now from all of our panelists to kind of we got both ends so far.
We are really close to Tom.
Okay.
40 of some, the 0029s have dwindled. We probably only have maybe 25 of those left. But the conservation stewardship and the forestry, 40, 50.
Gotcha. So not as big of a deal in your county?
No, but hard to maintain.
What about you, Jennifer?
What was that? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was asking Jennifer what her county looked like with these. Jennifer,
can you hear me now?
Were you muted?
We're having a lot of technical issues on our end, but I'm here now. We have quite a few conservation stewardship program properties, and we also run into a lot of problem with the timing of it, because a parcel sells and the new owner needs to reapply for the program, or hasn't applied for the program in the past. The parcel changes, and it seems like there's that gap where we're running into people are losing the assessment but haven't been approved for the new one yet. So we do certificate of errors, I believe, for up to 3 years. Once that is approved, we can go back and do certificate of errors. So that's the one thing I wanted to kind of put in there. We were having trouble, so we didn't catch all of what Maureen had to say about the flexibility that how they handle it in their county.
Gotcha. So it sounds like you're at least a little bit more in for conservation stewardships than most of the rest of the panel, but not to Maureen's level. I don't know. Maureen, do you have the most in the state?
I don't know. That would be interesting though.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you all on sharing your perspectives on that topic. And Jennifer, thank you for bringing up that certificate of error process as well. Jennifer, while you seem to be with us with your tech issues, I'm going to go ahead and move on to you next. You have a lot of energy production in your county. Let's talk about the solar one first. What questions do you most receive on the residential solar application?
Okay, so our biggest issue with the residential solar application has been we follow that by permits. If people receive the permit that they're going to be getting that, we send them out a letter and we send them out the application. And the biggest question is this going to raise or is this going to lower our assessment? So we currently in our county, we're in the collecting data phase. We're not raising assessments or lowering them at this point, but we are trying to encourage people to send those applications in. And we have a hard time. We don't have a really high success rate of getting those applications back in. But some of the questions that we receive on the actual application is we were struggling with, well, we lease, we don't own. Do we still need to fill this out? So we have tweaked our application a little bit. I believe that you have at least an excerpt of it. So right above number 5, solar system, circle 1, leased or owned. We added that. It seems to have slowed down the phone calls, at least, on people saying, do I need to fill this out or not? Because I only lease. So just adding that has seemed to help quite a bit. And then on number 6, we just added in parentheses or lease amount for write the total installed cost or lease amount of the solar energy system. Again, that reiterates to people that we're interested in collecting that data. And so they're filling it out. We're not getting quite as many phone calls on, do I need to fill it out?
Yeah, I thought that was a really unique solution to this that probably, I'm guessing that has helped you out quite a bit
I
once
think
you
it is
started.
slowed down. Yeah, because usually we send out these letters in batches and then we get quite a few phone calls, and most of them are asking, is this going to raise my assessment? Well, no, it's not going to automatically raise your assessment. We're trying to help keep your assessment down, and also the least question. So, and I know Mark has addressed the solar, residential solar a little bit further, and I would love to defer to him a little bit on how Kane County's handling it.
Well, we do, the applications are on the website. They're done on demand because the valuation is all done at the township level. We collect them, then send them out to the township assessors. The township assessors provide both the value as is and the value with a conventional electricity system. So that way we can meet the requirements, and then we can apply the tax rate at whatever is lower. But it's real important that we start collecting that data. And I know I've harped on this in a lot of forums. I want to keep on this. If we don't, and we just say, well, it's solar, I don't know that it affects it at all, and then we don't start collecting the data, what's going to happen is our sales ratio studies are going to start getting farther and farther off because of this, and we won't know why. If we remember when we started collecting data and learning about that right in basics of mass appraisal, we learned that we collect everything because we don't know what is going to be the important data that is going to show up here. So if solar energy affects the value of the property being sold, and it's going to show up in the sales ratio studies, but we don't account for it. Our sales ratio studies are going to be farther and farther off, and we're going to have to get higher and higher factors, farther and farther from one because of this. Now, if we collect the data and we apply the valuations properly, let's say solar adds 5% to the value of a property, their assessments are still going to be higher, and the sales ratio is going to be based on that, but the taxable value is going to be lower because this sets up an alternate value for solar energy. And so that's why it's important to have, and not just deducting it there, because while it gets to the same endpoint for the taxpayer, it'll make our data be worse. And it may not be a problem today, but we don't know when it's going to become a problem. That's why it's important we do things like Jennifer did. And what I like about what you did, Jennifer, was you started sending out applications and you got a lot of calls on something. So you adjusted your applications to reflect that. We all have the authority to do that to solve the problems in our own jurisdictions. The problems that I have in Kane County, for instance, just look at what we had for conservation stewardship, are not the sort of things they have in Jackson County. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on that, whereas Maureen really does. And I suspect we have differences on solar energy and what calls we get in our offices. So it's always okay to make sure the forms collect the data that's important for your jurisdiction. You don't need to solve the problems in your county the way I do unless you have exactly the same problems. And I'm pretty sure nobody has exactly the same problems as we have here.
Hey, Mark, do you carry that value then as a dual? So you carry those values as dual assessed values
Yes.
along with it.
Mhm.
Very good.
All right. Thank you all for that. And Mark, that is a very good point that you bring up, that, every jurisdiction, every county is going to have its own unique questions, unique issues. So good point. As we talk today, if someone's got a good idea that applies to something you're facing in your jurisdiction, please, by all means, take that information back with you. If you have any of those unique issues you're facing, I've seen the chat is empty so far, and we will get into your questions a little bit later, but if you guys have questions, just go ahead and start thinking of those now for a little bit later here. So thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for sharing that form
Of
on here.
course.
Again, I think that's just a very, simple change that you're able to make. It probably made quite a big difference there. So
We call that a win when we're able to make a simple change that it makes things easier down the road.
absolutely. All right, thanks a lot. All right, next let's talk to Amy. So I know you've recently taken over the supervisor of assessments role after being the chief deputy. In your office, what are some difficulties you face when you're administering preferential assessments?
Well, as far as deciphering the maps that we get sent with state forestry, conservation stewardship, the untimeliness with the DNR for new plans and cancellations. I was told in a conversation that we are not allowed to just take the plans away, cancel them ourselves if they're sold or if 10 years has expired, that we have to send the information to the DNR and they have to send us the cancellation. So we have plans that, are many, many years overdue expiration, and we still have them. Even sending our spreadsheets to the DNR, and I know that they're very busy. However, this continues to stay as a preferential assessment for now. So it's also confusing, factoring, issues with reporting to the Department of Revenue on the abstracts. Our assessors have the PAM system and we have DevNet, so we transfer data from PAMS to DevNet, and it has to be reported a certain way in the assessor's information, and then it goes into our, dual assessed, and the factoring, like I said, that's another thing. So it's just it's pretty confusing all around, and for the taxpayers as well. And fortunately, our township assessors do the valuing in our county. So we work closely with them with the valuations. But, the taxpayers just are a little unclear. What's going to save me the most money? How is this administered? What are my taxes going to be? It's just a little confusing.
Yeah. So how have you found anything so far that has helped you through some of these issues?
Lots of notes. Lots of talking, with my colleagues, staff meetings, what do you guys think, that we should do about this? Just a lot of communication, I believe is just the most important. And, forums like this is the best way to find out how other counties manage their exemptions or assessments.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else on the panel have anything to add on what Amy had just said?
Hey, Amanda, I would echo what Amy mentioned in regards to reporting to revenue. After 5 years and 10 abstracts, I finally think I know what they're looking for. The reclass table about was the end of me a few years ago, large part due to conservation stewardship. So that is that's not unique to any one county, I don't believe.
What I really don't like on the abstracts with the conservation stewardship is the reporting on two different lines. You've got, if you've got conservation stewardship that has a house on it, it's up here on line 13, but the land's down here on line 39, and you have to write revenue a note, even though it's the same thing every year. You got to repeat the note, and it's just such an awkward way to track it.
It really is. It really is
Yeah.
difficult, and to touch on another thing Amy mentioned as well, just the transfer of values from the township assessor and getting that market value, and then doing the 5% of that market value for their dual assessed. We set it, and then it seems like there's a handful the following year that it'll be reverted back on the values that we get, and yeah, it can be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all for sharing that. So I'm looking here on my notes. I think I'm going to jump to Mark for the next question here. So, Mark, as you mentioned earlier during the overview, some preferential assessments require applications and others don't. For those that do not require an application, which ones can be challenging to discover a qualifying use, and how have you handled it?
Well, I think the hardest one for us is farm. Coming into this job, I would have said farm is obvious. You're going to see crops, you're going to see cows, you're going to see pigs, et cetera, et cetera. But really, the definition of farm is much more detailed. There's some specific uses, but there's also that it has to be the primary use, and it has to go 2 years beyond the current assessment year, continue into the current year. And so oftentimes we get people calling up, hey, I've been farming this for 3 years, and so you got to lower my taxes. So generally, we've come up with kind of a set way of addressing this and talking to people and explaining that because of that look back where we have to see they've been farming it for a few years, you don't get to put one beehive on today and get a tax refund for this year's tax bill. We've encouraged them when they want to start farming use to immediately go out when the day they start it and talk to your township assessor. Invite the assessor to come out for a site visit and document it that day. It's a lot more persuasive to say, hey, 2 years ago I had you out and now it's time for the benefits to start accruing, than it is to say, oh, I pinky promise I was doing this. It's that. The other thing with farms is the drawing a line between what is farm and what is not farm. And that can be challenging. One of my favorite PTAB decisions, though, comes out of Lee County. Jennifer just leans back looking very happy there. And it wasn't a farmland decision. It was actually a subdivided land preferential decision where the guy had a lot next to him. He had subdivided it. He was going to sell it off, but he never did. And he was mowing it. He was using it as his yard. It was indistinguishable from his actual yard. And what PTAB ruled is if you're mowing it and it's landscape, that is your yard and it can't qualify for something else. Well, that logic also applies right into farmland because farmland really is what is your farm. Uh-oh. There we go. Thank you, Amanda. So a lot of that is what are they using as a yard? Even for things like, well, I have bees and the bees fly over my whole yard. So therefore, all of it must be that. Well, there's a question. What are you doing it? If your yard's being mowed, it may not qualify for bees, but it still needs to meet that 2-year definition prior to the current year. And because the property tax code defines year as a calendar year, that means to get farm in 2024, it must have started before January 1, 2022. Now, I don't know any farmers who go out on New Year's Day and start things, so that probably means something in 2021. But if they started planting in the spring of 2022, that's not going to get them 2 years to 2020 for 2024. So those are probably the biggest issues that we have is finding ones that qualify for farm because we don't see anything that triggers it. 1040, I mean, for section 1030 for subdivided land, a subdivision is done. We have to map the darn things. It's easy to catch those then. But looking at farm, often it's looking at that use and sometimes looking back at the use or looking back and seeing, has that use changed? We know what their farmland was 10 years ago, the last time we looked. Is it different now? And generally, we want to look at those every quad year. Farm can be notoriously difficult. It's most helpful if you have a GIS system with aerial overflights that you can compare one year to another. But if that's not available, sometimes the only way you find out is let's call them other interested parties. And by other interested parties, I'm talking about angry neighbors. And then you need to have a plan in place. When the person next door, I don't want to get involved, but they shouldn't be getting this. What's the drill? Do you go out and take a look at it? As long as you have a consistent plan for how you address those, I think you'll be fine. We won't make changes based solely on the anonymous nosy neighbor saying something. But if we take a look at it and we find something, then we take action based on what we found, not based on what the neighbors said.
We have a farmland questionnaire we make them fill out. It's 2 pages long. How many acres? What are you growing? How many acres of each thing are you growing? If you've got pasture or animals, what, tell us everything that's going on with this property. How long has this been going on? And we usually have the township assessor drive out and verify that, or township assessor usually knows it well enough to know that, yeah, he's been doing that or he hasn't been. So.
We also have a farmland questionnaire when there's people that haven't had the farmland assessment in the past that are that think that they might qualify. One question I have that to Mark's point about the mowed grass might not be farmland. It seems like we have a lot of, oh, it's hayed. It's hayed, and it will be a beautiful residential property, and maybe it's 10 acres, and they say they hay 5 or more of it. And I'm wondering if anyone has any advice or suggestions on what you look for when somebody is claiming it's hayed, it's farm.
I think hay qualifies. And I mean, do they roll it up in those big, rolls? I mean, if they do, then I don't know if they could submit pictures or proof
That would
that
definitely
way.
be something good to ask for evidence is, the roles, because a
Mhm.
lot of times when we ask if they are, if they're selling it, they'll say, we have an agreement. So basically, there may be a farmer that will take
Mhm.
it off of their hands for them because they're feeding it to their cattle. Um, but a lot of times it's very handshake agreements, and it's hard to really get evidence as to, is this truly fit the farmland definition.
I think one of the keys here is to make sure you equitably apply whatever method you use. If they just say, hey, yeah, we do this, and you take it for one, you really ought to take that word for the other. If you require a questionnaire or require a signed statement from all parties that this is what's being done, and may even require that annually to make sure it's still being done, then you apply that to everyone. I love what I'm hearing about the questionnaire. I just made notes to talk about it at a staff meeting coming up in a couple of weeks. So I've learned something from this today already. Um, but again, how we do this, we need to apply it equitably and across the board. I think if we do that, we'll probably be okay.
I agree. Appreciate that, Mark.
All right. Well, I'm glad our panelists are learning from each other too. This is amazing.
Well, you
Tom, I
go to
know you.
conferences, folks.
I'm excited, Mark, that even you were taking notes there. So that's you guys all told the instructor something. So Tom, I know you gave me a question earlier as well about farm and about farmland use changes that kind of goes along with what we've been talking about. How do you handle the use changes in your county?
Yeah, so Amanda, it seems a lot of times when something is going into farm, that'll be originated by the taxpayer themselves. We get a lot of inquiries about, hey, how can I receive a farmland assessment? However, there's, as Mark noted, aerials, and our mapping utilizes aerials for our GIS. When we're doing revisions, breaking a parcel, creating parcels, we will look at the land use, not only of that parcel, but parcels in the general vicinity, to ensure that the land use, whether it's cropland or pasture land or other farmland, contributory wasteland, is reflecting what we're seeing on those aerials. Now, the aerials are currently only being flown every 4 years. That's by our consortium GIS that we have in the county. So we do heavily rely on our township assessors, as that was also mentioned earlier. And if we do see something on the aerial that looks like, hey, we may need to make a land use change, we will reach out to the TAs to verify that. And then our folks will, in our mapping department, will run that through the system, make the changes, and then provide new farmland valuation cards to the township assessor. If we adjust the home site and we need a new non-farm land value, we'll also go out to them for that as well.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Before I move on to the next preferential assessment, was there anything else that the panel want? I know we could talk about farm the entire time here and then some, but were there any other like final things anyone wanted to say about farmland and use changes before we moved on to the next preferential assessment? Okay. All right, sounds good. So I'm just checking my notes here. Jennifer, I think I'm going to move back again. You guys have a lot of energy production. We keep bouncing between land and energy production throughout this call. I don't know if any of you, as I got questions earlier, gave me anything on the residential or multifamily sections. It was mainly heavy on these two here. So Lee County, you guys have a lot of wind production. Your predecessor, Wendy, and you, Jennifer, worked on some of the legislation that went behind that preferential assessment. When you're assessing wind turbines, do you assess if the owner of the wind energy device does not have I did not ask that question right. I'm sorry. Do you assess wind turbines if the owner of the wind energy device does not provide a survey?
So that is a problem that has been addressed in the past. That's been, it's a challenge for us to get that plat recorded, the survey recorded. We have to follow up several times, sometimes with the wind energy companies. I don't know that we have had to go to these extents, but Wendy and I have discussed in the past, and other counties have asked us, what are our options when we're having trouble getting those recorded surveys? And the wind energy companies are required by statute to get a recorded plat, so that we can make individual parcel numbers for the wind energy devices. And so then, like I said, we get to this point where the companies aren't responding to us. What are our next steps? And ultimately, without a survey, the assessment official would have no option but to apply the turbine to the entire original parcel. That would require changing the wind energy code, when the wind energy class, and it would require then that the assessment for the land with the wind energy devices would be going all to the property owners, which is what the statute exists to protect the property owners from this happening. So you wouldn't want to jump straight to doing that, but you may want to, if you haven't had luck with the wind energy companies, you may want to send out a letter to the owners and let them know that this is the requirement. And if we don't have the data that we need, the recorded plat, by a certain date, then we will have no choice but to go forward with that. And so then that's putting, that's motivating the owners. And that's really where I think that that you'll get some action, because the owners will get on these wind energy companies and follow up with them, because they don't want this happening. They don't want the valuation going on their tax bill. So that's really the standard that we've set up. Like I said, we haven't had to go to that extent yet, but we have, I have sent letters to the wind energy companies with the statute specifically, so they can see this is the statute, this is your requirement, we need this information. It's always a good idea to keep your state's attorney involved and let them know what's going on. The other question that we had previously was, can the zoning department, can they fine the companies for this? And the answer to that is the zoning department really does not have any authority for that. So, it's always good to keep the lines of communication open. Zoning might be able to help you out with a different person to contact, or, just have that communication open with them. But ultimately, they don't have any authority, and it's going to lie on us for the assessment. And the biggest thing to do for that is bring the owners in on it, so that they're aware of what's going on, and they'll advocate for you.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Jennifer. Do any of our other panelists with wind energy have any tips or any questions for Jennifer? I know you guys have kind of set the lead on that in your county.
If I ever get one, I'll give her a call.
I guess that could have been question first. Does anyone else have
we
the
don't
wind
have
energy
any
in their
wind.
county?
We're not very windy down here.
Yeah. None.
I was going to make a joke about the county board, but this is being recorded. So good.
Text it to me, Mark.
All right, so we got about 15 minutes left of our hour. So if you guys have anyone that's attending, if you've got any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm going to ask all of our panelists one final question here that will really dive into your questions. I'm going to ask this to everybody. Which preferential assessment seems to cause the most misunderstanding among taxpayers or other government officials? It may very well be one that we've already talked about, hence why we've probably already talked about it. But I'm just curious from each panelist here, which one of these really causes that biggest misunderstanding. So Amy, I'm going to head and start with you on this one.
Well, I think farmland would be a big one. At the time that 1031 was in effect, as opposed to 1030, that was absolutely horrible. Absolutely horrible. We don't have to deal with 1031 any longer. However, that was very, very misunderstood and hard to administer at the same time.
Yeah. All right. Mark, which one in your county is the most misunderstood or most
I'm going to
misunderstood?
say ditto to everything Amy just said. I think farmland, simply because there's so much of it, and there's so many different visions of farmland that people have, that can really be the issue. As far as 1031, yeah, that was a nightmare for us as well. I just, to get some look of what the differences in on some of these things, I noted that we have 9 forest management, 10 conservation stewardship, but we have 2,189 subdivided parcels. But back when 1031 was temporarily in place, back from 2009 to 2011, we had over 8,000 subdivided lots that were unsold going into the Great Recession. And yeah, we spent a lot of time dealing with some of those.
All right. Maureen, what about your county?
Back to the farmland and the programs and the difference between forestry management and conservation stewardship. And well, I'm growing ginseng in the woods, and it's farm, like we've already discussed.
All right. Tom?
Yeah, I concur. I think farmland is probably far and away the most confusing to taxpayers, and probably has the heaviest lift out of our office just in work hours trying to manage and administer. I have been running into some confusion on. I know we mentioned 1030, or 1031, but just in in 1030 in general, the developer's preferential. From some out-of-state developers who, instead of viewing it as a preferential assessment that they can purchase vacant or vacant land or land that's used as farm and put in infrastructure, curbs, gutters, whatnot, and then that'll kind of hold that value in place. They're viewing it something entirely different, where they purchased some property that was not vacant and maybe overpaid for it, and they're trying to get some sort of break on that. There's been a couple of those just in the last month that have come up, but we're working through those. But yeah, farmland, far away.
All right. Jennifer, I think you're the only one I haven't asked yet. So what about your county?
I completely agree. The farmland qualifications, people's idea of what they consider farmland, and applying the statutes that we have to that to see where it fits in, and then the different programs, conservation stewardship, forestry management, and seeing, do they need to apply for something like that. Our county has had a lot of larger farm parcels that would sell off a piece of the property, and then the new owners don't understand that they don't automatically qualify for the farmland assessment, and they need to be looking into some of these other programs, and such. So it's kind of, that's where we really get caught, is that you hope that when they're doing their due diligence, when they're researching and purchasing property, to see what's going to happen to the value, because it's not the actual land that we're assessing. But I mean, it's the land we're assessing, but it's based on the land use. And
Mhm.
in that changes, when the property changes hands, it could possibly be changing.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask this question to all of our attendees. Drop it in the chat. Do you agree with our panelists that farmland is the most misunderstood preferential assessment in your county with taxpayers or government officials? Is there a different one in your county that's more challenging to explain? Yeah, just go ahead and put it in the chat. I'm curious if this is something we're all aligned with, or if there are some unique problems or different situations across the state. For those of you that maybe haven't used Zoom much or are taking a class with us, there should be a bar at the bottom of your screen where you're able to hit a chat button to bring that up. We've got a quiet group.
Mhm.
And at this time too, if you've got any questions at all, go ahead and either you can unmute and ask us, or if you want to drop those in the chat, you could do that too. All right, we've got a couple answers here. Looks like we got some farmland in agreement here.
Amanda, I have a question, about open
Even
space.
Cook, I'm so sorry here, Amy. I saw Cimarron wrote Cook County even farmland. That is amazing. I'm sorry, Amy. That
No,
just
it's
like
okay.
caught my eye there. Go ahead.
I have a question about open space to anybody that can answer. What other kind of uses? Typically in our county, it's just used for golf courses. We really haven't had any applications outside of that. However, recently, we do have somebody who is a lake. It's a man-made lake. Wondering if that would be a qualifying preferential assessment for that. And also, the statutes read that the application needs to be in by June 30th. However, we were told by this gentleman that the law had changed and was allowing for it to be turned in anytime, and use certificates of error for it. And I was wondering if anybody could help me out here.
Amy, I'm the one who changed the law. And June 30th was the change. The original date was January 31st.
Okay.
And no, a certificate of error is not permissible for this. In fact, my state's attorney has already written a brief saying that we have no authority to issue a certificate of error because a timely filed verified application is a prerequisite for this. And we have people who forget every year. And every year I just had they go around talking to lawyers, and I get the lawyers giving me a phone call. I said, look, this is what I've got. This is what the state's attorney says. There's nothing that allows them to actually get that. They've never been successful for it. So I'm not sure who's telling you that, but it's certainly different than what I've heard from anybody else. It's certainly different how how we did that. Now,
I'm only bringing this up because it was a former supervisor of assessments and in a county in Illinois. So I thought all along I was correct, but then I started doubting myself when he brought.
well, the reason that I drafted the change was we had somebody who was late, and it was now March. And so yep, I see Bev Doran is still on there. Bev's even turned on her microphone so she can jump in here with all this, because Bev was here when this happened. So we had a guy who had a golf course. His attorney didn't file the forms. I think his attorney became his ex-attorney after that. But I said, send in the forms, and then let's see if we can get something to the legislature changing it effective for this year. Well, the legislature did change it, but not until a year after that, and they did not make it retroactive. Believe me, if they had any chance of getting that changed, they would have done that. They would have sued. They would have gotten a judge to issue an order, but they couldn't, because the law is really super strict on open space. And so that's why it's specifically right in the law, they waive that right to that valuation if they don't have it in. That doesn't exist on the other things. That very phrase means something. If it didn't mean that, then what does it mean? What it means is they can't get it. That deadline is a hard line, where the other ones, we can do certificates of error for.
Yeah, we try to be we're more proactive in our open space than a lot of the other things, because it is such a hard and fast deadline. And, having an accountant not turn in the open space form, and then their place of business or golf course or whatever they work for is hit with, these are high tax dollar bills that these turn into pretty rapidly. So we try to send reminders, even though we're not statutorily required to email reminders, just to try to get everybody in before that deadline date.
We had one last year where they simply left 3 parcel numbers off. There was a golf course, they had a number of parcel numbers, they left 3 off. Well, we don't look at that and say, well, obviously they meant to have those 3 on there and just forgot. They can be taking that off because there is a clawback for that. If they're planning on developing this, they may not want to pay all that back with interest. There may be a reason they haven't done. We have changes of use where they no longer want open space, so they don't file. As of right now, we have 157 open space uses in Kane County. So we spend a lot of time on this, but they aren't the same ones every year. Things do move in and out of this. And Bev, if I've said anything incorrect, because Bev is the one who handles this for me, jump in the chat or something. But in general, it's on them to apply, and we're applying the law the same. Because at what point is it, well, should we be going back? Should our, if we did this for a golf course, there might be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Should the school district refund that to a private golf club? Right. I don't see why they should, and why that then the school district should suffer the loss of that revenue.
So Mark, do you have other uses other than golf course?
We do have a few which are just natural areas. Golf courses certainly dominate the use, but a few of them are natural areas. So the actual statute's a little more expansive. So looking at this, this is section 10-155. It says it has to be more than 10 acres and actually and exclusively used for maintaining or enhancing natural or scenic resources. B, protects air or streams or water supplies. C, promotes conservation of soil, and there's a whole bunch of things, and including any body of water, whether man-made or natural. So I think, Amy, that goes to kind of the questions on there. Yeah. D is where it comes up mostly, conserves landscaped areas, such as public or private golf courses. E is enhances the value to abutting property. F is preserves historic sites. And definitely, and this is where that residential use is also important. Land is not considered used for open space purposes if it is used primarily for residential purposes.
All right. Oh, I think we have a question here. Dare I ask about bees? I will direct our panelists to the chat here. We've got a question, a very specific question about a parcel and their beehives. I guess the question here, what are you all allowing in terms of acres per hive?
In Kane County, we do not use an acres per hive formula. It's whether they're using it or not. So if they have beehives and it is otherwise fallow and it looks something that looks reasonable, like they have that, we're going to go ahead and go with that. If they're mowing it down to the ground like a lawn, then we're not. Having said that, I'm always open to looking at it a little bit differently, and I think the way you're describing that is kind of intriguing. The real issue, though, is if it's used for residential, even if that brings it down, that wouldn't necessarily be make it farm. I did, when I was in the private sector, I appraised a number of horse farms. And there is a general amount of acreage you need per horse to make the farm viable. A lot of them are well below those acreage. So I know people try to shoot things onto smaller parcels, whether they should or not.
So so what's interesting to me when you say if it's cut, you don't allow, I have, I have like two opposite sides of the spectrum in Lake County. One where I call the bee whisperer that brings me honey and he's all organic and, you know, he's doing everything the right way. And then I have this other guy. And so the bee whisperer actually, I signed up for a class called like the bee lawn. And he's been educating me and sending me articles in terms of, you know, the clover that these bees actually need to survive. You actually do need to, like, there's a specific cutting season that you need to cut the lawn in terms of letting the clover grow and bloom. And then there's a clover bloom and then a dandelion bloom, and very specific timing that you do need to cut the lawn different, you know, lengths for the bees. So I don't necessarily agree that if the lawn is cut, that it's out.
I didn't mean by cutting it to say as simply as any cutting at all. What I mean is if it is landscape, so it is indistinguishable from their lawn.
Correct. Right.
That's where the Lee County case is really helpful, because that's how PTAB looked at it. You're looking at, I can't see the difference between your yard, where your yard ends, and where you're claiming this other use begins. Definitely, even if they're cutting hay, you still have to cut it at some point. So they're not plowing it under every year. So the cutting is certainly allowed. What I mean is cutting it like the whole regular lawn. If you can't tell the difference, it's probably not farm.
Yeah, we're getting in a little bit of trouble up here in Lake County because somebody had put out a publication stating, you know, something about, I can't even remember because there's been so many kind of iterations of it. 1 acre for the first hive, and then a half an acre for every hive after 4 hives, or something like that. So the people are coming in and saying, you know, I have 50 hives. I want, you know, 50 acres of farm. And I'm more of the agreement with you, like where I meet with these people, I talk with them, and I'm very open and blunt that, look, we're going to look at a map and we're going to see what actually is being used for your farming purposes, in terms of actual acreage. But there's nothing in any ag law stating any kind of acreage per hive, and it's like a constant battle up here what to do.
Yeah. I have heard that Lake County is the beehive capital of North America. I think that was meant to be a hyperbole.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you,
Lisa.
Yeah, thank you so much. I believe we have come to the end of our time here together. I do want to do a plug for our preferential assessments course next month. If you have not taken this class yet and you want to talk for 2 full days on preferential assessments with Mark, join us in a couple weeks in East Peoria. We've got a couple seats still remaining there. Otherwise, thank you all so much for coming. We will have another webinar sometime this fall, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.